Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Joint Project Earth 101. So, today I am Rivaldi Limantara, will be your host, and I'm a PhD lecturer at Ciputra University, Indonesia. And today we have special guests talking about the topic is connectivity and appropriation. So, the guest speaker for today is Robert Gibb, an associate professor international and a course director, MA postgraduate studies in visual communication design at Birmingham City University, UK. He is a very specialist in uh, some areas, actually, including visual communication design, photography, fine art, curation, creative thinking strategies, and art and design history. It's quite interesting. He has developed a lot of things, and one of them is appropriation and connectivity that we want to discuss today. As an associate professor for international, he's currently teaching us conceptual thinking, design philosophies, and innovation design as visual communication.
So, thank you for Rob. There you go, I'm here. Hi. So we have two classes. So the first one
Uh-huh.
is in 16th floor, and the other one is from 18th floor. So we have 109 students. So we have
All right.
109 students here. We'll be listening to you, and I guess you will talk about connectivity and appropriation, right?
Yep. What I'm going to be talking about is the connections between kind of fine art areas, advertising, and occasionally some political bits. Small disclaimer, there might be some just elements of slight nudity in it, but they're all just fairly straightforward. And then there's some political things in there as well, all based on kind of Western European canon.
All right.
Before we start, what I'll say is there are some elements in it that are quite interesting. So I'm just going to share my screen at the moment. Fingers crossed this works. Desktop share. You should now all be able to see, fingers crossed. And it would be useful to make some notes as you go through this, or if you can't make notes, just use your phone and maybe do some take some photographs of what you're going to see. Is that okay, Ray?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Shall I
Cool.
start? Perfect. So this is called appropriation and connectivity. So I'm just going to say, good artists copy, great artists steal. Does anyone know who said that? It is in fact Pablo Picasso. So good artists copy, great artists steal, which is quite interesting. So I'm going to show you this quote, which will make sense right at the end. So if you want to make some notes on this, it could be really interesting. So it is that nothing is original. Okay, that's a really interesting part. So we're going to talk about these various points. So one, notions of originality. What is original? Where it come from? Cultural context within your chosen medium. So that's really important, how the cultural context within specific areas is relative to where your ideas might come from. So what I'm taking you through today is mainly kind of Western European, but it's to do with the cultural context. So that's hugely important, whichever cultural context you happen to be in. The relationships developed from existing forms of historical culture. That'll be different for everyone in every country, but it's actually quite interesting how similar some things are. Then I'm going to talk a bit about pastiche, synchronicity, and conceptual appropriation. So pastiche is essentially where you can take the same ingredients of design, composition, color, and you create something that looks similar. That's useful. Synchronicity is quite different. That's where two people have the same idea or do the same development of work, but at different points on the planet. So that's interesting. And then it's conceptual appropriation, which is where you'll find a lot of advertising tends to get some ideas from. And that is where you take the concept in one form and you shift it into another form. So we're going to talk about connectivity first. So we're going to look at this. So you steal from anywhere that resonates with inspiration or fuels your imagination. So on the left-hand side, we have a study of a man called Louis Bertin by the French painter Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. And then on the right-hand side, we have the actual painting itself. The reason for showing you that is that form and that style is then appropriated 30, 40 years later by photographers. So that style of the classical portrait is turned into this. So on the left-hand side, you have Victor Hugo, the author, the writer of, amongst other things, Hunchback of Notre Dame. And on the right-hand side, you've got a man called Rossini, who is one of the world's most famous musicians at the time, composers. And these are both portraits by Etienne Cartier, but the form they take, the style they take, is completely appropriated and used from painting, classical French painting, portrait painting. And therefore, what we end up with is a style that's adopting another style, sometimes to give it legitimacy. So in other words, the photographs look like paintings, therefore you take the photographs more seriously. It's quite an interesting idea. So you have to devour old films, new films, music, books, paintings, photographs, poems, dreams, random conversations, architecture, bridges, streetlights, trees, clouds, bodies of water, lights, shadows, everything. Okay? Does anyone know who this woman is? If you do, just shout out very quickly and then I'll move on. You probably don't recognize her. I know that none of my students have ever seen her before. She's just a worker during the Second World War in California. She's fixing parts. This is her. You'll recognize her probably more when you see her like this. So this is not her. This is actually a magazine editorial for Tank magazine by a man called Matteo Bertoli. He's a photographer. And what he's done is he's used collage to make sense of this image. Now, we only know this image on the right-hand side because we recognize where it comes from. So the woman on the left-hand side is obviously Marilyn Monroe before she became Marilyn Monroe and was Norma Jean Baker. So we have this element on the other side that comes from another source. So this is a 2004 image for a magazine that actually comes from, you'll recognize it. Most of you are able to say, this is actually, it looks a lot like Andy Warhol. And the whole point is, it does, because that's the main source of the piece. So, pardon me. So without Andy Warhol's Marilyn, oh, sorry, Ray, I'm not used to getting up this early. Without Andy Warhol's Marilyn, you're not able to have the image on the right-hand side by Matteo Bertoli. It's not possible. So we recognize one form from another. So one is a piece of kind of fine art, becomes a piece of fine art, screen print. Then it shifts through time. You know, you're talking about, you know, what, 40, 50 years, 60 years, 50 years, where it then shifts into that. But that notion of knowing what Marilyn Monroe looks like only through Andy Warhol, that changes. So this is another variation of his. However, a photographer like David LaChapelle has recreated it in another form. So the right-hand side image is a piece of photography, and then Andy Warhol's screen prints on the other side. But without the original, you don't understand the modern versions. So does anyone recognize the style and form of this? Again, this is a fashion editorial. It's a piece for a magazine called Zinc, 2006. And it's very interesting. It's called Masterpiece. So the title is a very interesting kind of pointer to what the work might be about. And then the little speech bubbles with, you know, their dots spreading everywhere. We immediately know, actually, it's going to come from Roy Lichtenstein's work that he did in the 1960s and 70s using kind of dot system. But where does he get these ideas from? When Lichtenstein is, you know, is a student, a young boy, he's influenced by magazines and cartoons especially. So that becomes useful. Comics are the basis of the form and the design that he uses. And then his work is then, or style, is appropriated and used by Mike Ruiz for Zinc magazine. So if you recognize the masterpiece at the top, you've obviously seen the Lichtenstein work at some point in the past previously. And that style is then used and appropriated by lots of people. So this is a set of adverts using almost the exact same style, but this is for Volkswagen. So this is 2013, and it's Volkswagen using the same sort of approach. So you suddenly go, oh, very useful. So select only things to steal that speak directly to your soul. If you do this, your work and theft will be authentic. The key word there is authentic. So the notions of originality push to one side and talk about what authenticity is. Authenticity is invaluable and originality is non-existent. This big quote I'll show you completely at the end. Makes sense. So authenticity is invaluable. Originality is non-existent. So if I were to show you this, oh no, I'm showing you this, so it's perfectly okay. again, a magazine spread. Every single one of you probably recognize at least one of the forms. And so this is just based on René Magritte and the kind of surrealist work he was producing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. But without recognizing where Magritte comes from, you wouldn't recognize these elements. So the idea is not necessarily new, but how it's reused becomes much more interesting. So, and don't bother to conceal your thievery. You have to celebrate it if you feel like it. Okay, so this is a painting by Vermeer, Johannes Vermeer, and it's the studio, the painter's studio, 1665. Interestingly, probably done using a camera obscura or something like this, but we're not entirely sure. And then in another form, it's reused by some photographers. So you have this element here, but then you also have this element, which is made up of 9 panels of individual prints. So without the first one, you can't have the second. Without the second, you can't have the third from that series. We then have this is the Roque Venus, Velasquez, 1640, Spanish. And it's an interesting allegory. People recognize it. It's quite famous, but it's then reused multiple times. So Sam Taylor Wood, for example, has produced this as part of her soliloquy series. But Orlan, French performance artist in the 1970s, is using the same material. So even something as simple as just the shape, the composition, the design, if people recognize the original source, the secondary and tertiary sources, people buy into, they understand where it comes from. And I think that part is something you can apply to virtually any cultural aspects. So this is very simple. Going back to Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, this is his painting of the Grand Odalisque. But this is a piece by Michael Thompson of Julianne Moore, the actress, and it's almost identical in terms of design, style, lighting. There may be elements of post-production, I'm not sure, but you can recognize the form and where it comes from. If you don't know where the original version comes from, you can still be quite impressed by the design and shape that Michael Thompson's given to Julianne Moore. So what is conceptual appropriation? It's a question. So conceptual appropriation is where you'll take the idea and in some way reshape, reform, reapply to something else. So this is an example of an album cover by a woman called Paloma Faith, where it's quite controversial and it's designed possibly to be controversial, but the source of the material is this. So this is called the deposition of Christ in kind of Christian culture, where Christ comes down from the cross. Paloma Faith's album, the designers have decided to use a similar piece. However, it's in some cultures argued, I would say, it's blasphemous, because what it's doing is it's saying, well, actually, we're turning Christ into a woman, and then all the people around surrounding Paloma Faith coming down are Paloma Faith herself, just photoshopped in. That's an interesting element where someone has decided that they could sort of make something that in some cultures might be seen as offensive, but the form and the design, if you know where the original comes from, impacts on how you read the actual album cover itself. Quite controversial, but it's one of these things you think, interesting. But that notion of using elements where things come from, so this is like, Lucas Cranach, 1520s. This is, again, the Garden of Eden being reimagined as an installation by a man called Ron O'Donnell. And this is the same element being used for a catalogue for a photography show in 2009. The same elements, the design, the composition, the structure are what holds it together. But because they come from an original source, it gives a level of legitimacy. So move on to this. You probably won't recognize this. Most people don't. This is, in inverted commas, evidence that fairies actually exist. And I think the woman's either Elsie Griffiths, I can't remember the woman's name. And this is called the Cottingley Fairies. It's Elsie Wright, sorry. And this is 1917. And what you have to bear in mind here is 1917 in Europe, there's a world war happening. And interestingly, these photographs were taken by the children themselves. And when the adults developed them, they said, oh, these are photographs of fairies. Where did you find these? And because you might not be able to see it on screen, but these fairies are slightly blurred. And that's because it looks like they're moving slightly. And for years, decades, both children said these were real fairies. And people bought into the fact that these could be real. So they gave them a camera and they photographed the fairies again. And what you end up with is actually these become real. And it's not until well, not so it's sort of 5 or 6, maybe 7 decades later, they sort of said, actually, no, they're fake. But the point is, in 1917 in Europe, people want to buy into things and believe that there's more than just one thing on this planet. So it does become quite interesting. But without the Cottingley fairies, and it's a really good film of it, by the way, you should try and see it. But without the Cottingley fairies, you don't have things like this. So this is Matt Collishaw from his photography series, Catching Fairies. Or you have it being reused by Nokia and photographer Rankin to sell phones. Or you actually have the BBC in Northern Ireland using the same ideas of what are fairies. So the fact that we have these original sources means you can take the idea, the concept, you can appropriate it and put it into other forms, whether it's Matt Collishaw's fine art or Nokia's to sell phones or to promote channels on television. That becomes interesting. Changing it slightly, this is called The Hay Wain by John Constable, and this is 1821. Pardon me, 1821. And most people in Britain will have or understand where this comes from. It's an idealized version of the English landscape. So that's what most people in England will say, yep, this is an idealized version. So whenever you see this image, it already has a meaning. And you'll see it from growing up from very young. If it's reused, and it is here, it's reused by a man called Peter Kennard. And all he's done is a piece of collage. So he's cut out some weapons, in this case, cruise missiles, and he's put them onto the Hay Wain. And then he's rephotographed this and produced this piece of work. This is quite important. This is a piece of political art. So in 1983, in Britain, in a place called Greenham Common, there were missiles that were put into place called cruise missiles. And if I remember rightly, I think the American government could choose to fire them if they needed to or if they wanted to. And there were protests by protesters at Greenham Common, and there was a giant camp eventually developed. And this is a piece of political art that shows this is no longer a green and pleasant land. It's being occupied, in this case, by cruise missiles from another country. Eventually, this helped, I think, to cause the place to close down. But it is the notion that without the first one of the idealized landscape, and then this being reappropriated, you couldn't have either. So it's quite an interesting piece. So in terms of politics, something as simple as this reshaped some of how the audiences began to read the image. So we're going to get into these elements now. Some of these are slightly disturbing, but they're of their time. So this is a man called Goya. This is Goya's Disasters of War. And these are etchings. So this is before photography, before any methods of recording. And what he's done is he's showing the aftermaths of war. So these were published in 1863, a whole series of these etchings. This is a variation of the same scene, but again, this is done as a kind of three-dimensional sculpture, and it's by Jake and Dinos Chapman, the Chapman brothers. And again, great deeds against the dead. So they're talking about how you can take a one-dimensional flat, well, 2D object and turn it into a 3D object, which is this notion that you can now walk around this whole scene. But again, appropriating the idea in this form. They published a whole series of these things. So you can actually buy copies of the Disasters of War because there are multiple etchings. So what happens when you buy a piece like this? It's a piece of kind of historical kind of fine art. It's also a piece of social commentary. The Chapman brothers have done this. So what they've done is they've painted little clown faces or kind of grotesque faces onto the surface of one piece that they've bought. Question, and this is a question you have to think about, and it's a kind of ethical, possibly philosophical question. Have they destroyed a piece of work, in this case, with or without reason, or have they created something new? So there's a question in there, and there's an ambiguous question and a philosophical question, that the answer is they've done both, but it depends on your point of view. Should they have done this to the original, or should they have left the original as it was, as it is? So I think from that point of view, are you destroying or are you creating? And then the question is, in order to create something new, even from these original sources, should you destroy what there is? So that's a very interesting debate. I'm going to talk about that probably later on in the next section, purely on the basis of, if you own an object, can you do whatever you like to the object? In other words, if you own a Goya print, can you do whatever you want to it? So that's quite useful. This is Monet's Gardens at Giverny, quite a famous painting, worth millions and millions of pounds. This is a variation of it. Can anyone think of who the artist might be? That's the question. You probably won't recognize it from the style. If it's in another style, you probably would recognize this particular artist's style. So this has some shopping trolleys in the garden, in the river, and it's got some traffic cones, and we still recognize it from the bridge format. But this is by Banksy. So Banksy, probably most famous for doing kind of street art and doing kind of spray paint, kind of silhouette material, really quite interesting. But when we look at this, it's called Show Me the Monet. So there's also a play on words. So Monet's the original artist. This is then Show Me the Monet. And the interesting thing is, if you contextualize the work, in other words, you put it into a context where it's not just the things we're seeing on screen at the minute, you get this. So it suddenly changes and it becomes a piece of fine art, but we recognize the source. And I think that's where you can, the appropriation of more than just concept, but in this case, style and content change how we read it. So that's a really important part to think about, how you can appropriate more than just a style, more than just content. And the other thing is, when you start to do appropriate materials, even the conceptual materials, you're changing how the audience understands it, but you're relying on the audience to have some knowledge of the original source. Therefore, the more famous the original source, the easier it is for the audience to buy into it. So that's an important part. So what are the notions of originality and appropriation? So I was just having some tea there. So this is important. This is the front cover of the magazine. It's the New Yorker. Most of you, I'm assuming, will recognize the form and design of where this comes from. Okay, so most of you will be able to say, exceptionally famous, iconic. We all recognize the fact that this is the Mona Lisa. However, how the Mona Lisa is being reused is important. What you need to think about is when things are reused, why they're reused. So if you look at this magazine cover, it's the magazine cover, the New Yorker. If you understand that New Yorker is a kind of satirical political magazine, it's useful. What's more important is to look at the date in the top right-hand corner. So the date is February the 8th, 1999. So you then have to ask yourself, what's happening on that date in America, probably in New York, that allows the magazine to use this form? Well, in 1999, American President Bill Clinton was trying to be impeached for having an affair, in inverted commas, an affair, which he said he did not have sexual relations with that woman. And the woman is photoshopped in there, is called Monica Lewinsky. And she was, I think, one of the interns that worked in the White House at the time. So there is this kind of interesting element where you've taken something classical where everyone recognizes the design, and then you put it onto the front cover. The thing the Mona Lisa is most famous for, well, lots of things actually, is her smile. And it's described as enigmatic. You know, we're not sure what's behind the smile, what the eyes are. So that's why we're using Monica Lewinsky in this format. What's in her mind? Kind of useful. But the notion of using something really famous, especially from the world of art, whether it's in advertising, whether it's in commercial work, whether it's reinterpreting some of the notions and the ideas, is interesting. So if we take the Mona Lisa again, this is Yasumasu Morimura, and this is his version of the Mona Lisa. But what he's doing is, again, there's a lot of kind of dropping himself in, photoshopping, but he wants to ask the question, why does the Mona Lisa smile like this? What is it? So he has his suggestions, and he'll refer back to the original sources from Leonardo's sketchbooks. So here we have the variation we normally see, but then he strips her bare like this, and he photoshops in a whole set of materials. So there's a lot of Photoshop of, oh, the reason she's smiling is she's pregnant. He then goes back to the original sources of Leonardo's sketchbooks and does this. So he's creating an anatomical diagram of a child in the womb. So that's one of the reasons he thinks she may be smiling. It's an interesting idea when you see it as a triptych, but if you go back to the original sources, so we have this, it actually comes from Da Vinci's drawings and his notebooks. So Morimura, the kind of artist who's made this work, has a very solid background of understanding Leonardo da Vinci's work and the sketchbook materials as source. So he's not just appropriating the material, he's making a direct connection between what he's producing in the piece on the right, the left, and the work that Da Vinci has done in sketchbook form as a scientific method. Kind of interesting. It's not new, though, to use really famous works of art. So this is a really famous painting in America. It's called American Gothic by Grant Wood. And this is, again, famous piece by Vincent van Gogh. So stylistically, we recognize the work. If someone wants to reappropriate it, they can be really bizarre. This is by, this is for McDonald's, and it's specifically, the cultural context is Sweden. And all that the agency has done is added, you can see it in the middle there, on the fork, a piece of bacon. Is it offensive? In some cultures, yes. This only works in Sweden. The Swedish people got a certain sense of humor, which makes it funny. But the title of this is A Classic with a Twist, a classic with bacon. And all they've done is literally take a famous piece of work of art and add something to it, Photoshop it in. Does it work? In parts of Britain, we would just go, well, it's not that funny, really, no. But in Sweden, it seemed to go down really well. So they've used that format, and everyone's going, this is very funny. So culturally, how you design works for specific audiences, you have to take on board how people think, how they see, how they understand elements of culture. So it's very interesting. The same thing's been done by lots of places. Lego did the exact same format, where they took the same paintings and reappropriated them in this form. They almost begin to look like kind of pointillist pictures, but they're just parts of Lego and people recognize them. So again, recognizing the original source, you can appropriate the complete composition if necessary and reappropriate for anything from selling a burger right through to selling Lego. So some of you might recognize this. I'm hoping some of you are going, I think I know where this comes from. Okay, so that's one aspect of this. Here's a second aspect, just a series of bottle openers to open a bottle of beer. But it is, in fact, the print by Hokusai. You know, it's the Great Wave of Kanagawa. Again, because it's so well known, and I don't mean just in some countries, maybe around the globe, people will recognize this form. You can then use it to make sense of it. This might be a bit more difficult to sort of understand. This is an advert for a union in the United Kingdom. The form and shape and design come from Damien Hirst's The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, and the shark in the tank. And what's interesting here is that form, he designs it, he comes up with it. It comes from other sources, which he has found, but he's probably the most famous person who's done this. It's then reused by people like David LaChapelle as a piece of fashion editorial, or as a piece of kind of design for windows in Hong Kong, or by people like Alexander McQueen, just to show what it is. But they wouldn't exist without Damien Hirst's first version. Oh, pardon me. So that makes sense. This is important. One of the things, so for example, David LaChapelle was interviewed by a woman called Anne-Celine Yeager for her first edition, I think it was, of a book called Image Makers, Image Takers. And she asked him a very interesting question. She said, where do you get your ideas from for the work that you do in terms of your designs? And he said, I got it from most of the things I learned at college when I was a student. And when you look at this piece here, we see two models draped and dressed in red material. And then in the background, we have a house, well, we assume it's a house, which is also draped in materials, in this case, red materials. But the source from this, as Le Chapelle would be able to say, is Jean-Claude and Christo. So these are two artists, sadly both now dead, and they spent their career doing installations in landscape and wrapping buildings or putting walls across valleys of material. So an interesting idea. So again, in David LaChapelle's development as a commercial photographer and an artist and a filmmaker, he's using sources he learned when he was a student. So what you're learning right now, you should use some of this in the future. Or you will use some of this in the future. So the form and design here it's Leonardo DiCaprio, 1995. It's just an editorial piece for The Face magazine, again by David LaChapelle. The form looks like an old postcard or possibly an old poster. Even the use of type in the bottom right-hand corner, it's, icons of Hollywood, LaChapelle Studio, Hollywood. The form of this comes from this, Marlon Brando, The Wild Ones, 1953, and almost like the invention of the rebellious teenager in America, which then travels the world and people have teenagers cropping up in the UK in the 1950s and 60s. Before teenagers arrived, and this sounds weird, most people would eventually just wear what their parents wore. They would develop into a version of their parents or their grandparents. Here, you're talking about adopting the style that says Leonardo DiCaprio is rebellious. We know this because Marlon Brando is in The Wild One, and we recognize the design and shape. That becomes useful. Some of you might recognize this, but I know that most people won't. It looks like Andy Warhol, and it looks like one of the pieces he did towards his death, but it is in fact by a man called Gavin Turk. So he's one of the young British artists. I think he came out of the Sensation exhibition in the 1990s. And interestingly, it has a title. When you start to use titles with bodies of work, with anything, you change the viewer's perception and understanding of what it might be about. So you can either guide them with a descriptive title, like this one is Camouflage, Fright Wig, Gold and Taupe, or you can make them symbolic or metaphoric of other things. So titles, hugely, hugely important. So this is actually based on the original version of Andy Warhol's self-portrait Camouflage. So the interesting thing is here, Gavin Turk has called it Camouflage, so very similar in terms of what Andy Warhol has done, but then he's called it Fright Wig. In other words, he might be having a pop at Andy Warhol. Does Andy Warhol wear a wig? I'm not sure, but we're saying in here, Gavin Turk might take that point of view. If we then compare that to this, knowing the story of the original source material is important. So you can appropriate not just the physical design or the concept, but you can actually appropriate how it's understood. So this is a painting which is enormous. I've never seen it in the flesh myself. I'd love to. I think it's in Paris. And these are life-size figures. And this is called the Raft of the Medusa. So here we have the Pogues who are doing an album cover, very similar. Now, what you have to bear in mind about the Raft of the Medusa is it was a ship that I think it was 1813 or 1817, can't remember, and it sank. And the people who managed to survive, they stayed on a raft for, I don't know, I think it was weeks. And there were 16 people at the beginning, but when the raft was found, there were only 13 people left. So the obvious thing to ask is, well, what happened to the other three? Well, they died and actually people started to eat them. Not good. If you know that, then you understand how the Pogues have used this for their album cover. But then you also understand how it's been redesigned and reused as a political cartoon photograph about George W. Bush, or even as a fashion piece. So yeah, 1818 was, so not 17. So once you know this, you can understand that that concept of cannibalism is then being reused in various forms. And that's where you start to sort of understand the kind of appropriation of not just the concept and the idea, but actually the narrative itself. So that concept, that appropriation of narrative can be really quite interesting. Right, this is an advert for Volkswagen. Some of you may be able to recognize what it is. I'm going to count to 5, and if one of you can shout out, just say what it is. So what do you think it is? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can anyone recognize it? Probably. I think you probably can. Actually, it's a dot, join the dots, and it's based on Dali's The Persistence of Memory. Okay, so that idea of taking something famous, then completely reshaping and rechanging it, in this case, almost into a child's game, where you can join the dots. And then once you've joined the dots, you can fill the dots in. So Escher, you suddenly go, oh, okay, this is really quite clever. I mean, this is world famous, and you recognize elements of it when you suddenly go, I think I know where it comes from. Is taking the original painting Guernica, here we go, and deconstructing it, literally deconstructing it into another form. So that idea of taking other forms, you can take them and use them for multiple sources. So this is no longer about, taking a piece of fine arts and asking the viewer to view it in a different way. This is actually deconstructing it and turning it into a game, but still to advertise Volkswagen. So in terms of a car, where does it sit? So I'm going to talk about this. So it's a series of posters. I'm assuming that most of you at some stage might have seen E.T. This album, this film poster is by John Alvin, and it's very, very famous. Where do you think the original idea for the alien finger and the human finger come from? Most of you should be able to go, I recognize this. It's based on the Sistine Chapel, Adam and Eve, well, sorry, the creation of Adam. So this is an interesting thing that we know where the idea comes from. Okay, so very, very interesting. If you look at how posters are designed, film posters, they will take ideas from lots of other sources, and you're appropriating small elements. So this is a really famous painting by the German painter Caspar David Friedrich, and it's about the solemnity of, the sublime being a man alone in the landscape against nature, one person against the world. Really quite famous. And it's just a shot, a painting of the man's back. You don't see his face, so the man is just representing, humanity, the man against nature. That form and design is important, because if you know that the idea and the narrative is one person against nature, you can then reuse it. So this is Cliff Richard, who's a UK singer, well, world singer, for an album called Heathcliff, using the same idea, literally appropriating the background and twisting it around, reshaping it. David Tennant in his performance as Hamlet. So that idea of we know where it comes from is used multiple times. So it's used in Spider-Man 2, the lone hero against the world, or Captain America, lone hero against the world. Star Trek, Into Darkness, the lone villain against the world. So all of these things tie into other sources in terms of not just the narrative, but sometimes the composition and the design. So this is interesting. You have to understand where things come from in order to understand where you're going to take them to. Makes sense at the end. So this is Saint Sebastian, and this is Guido Reni. And if you understand that the story behind Saint Sebastian is that he was asked to bow down to another gods, and he said no, and then he was used as target practice by the Roman soldiers. That then allowed you to read how these images are used. So both of these are saying, yep, this is about sacrifice. This is about my belief in my faith. This will not happen. This is Yukio Mishima posing for this. So he is, or was, a Japanese writer, and he had his own private army. Quite interesting. If you ever get a chance to see a film, Mishima is a really interesting film with a great soundtrack. But that form and design gives the images legitimacy. This is Ricky Gervais, British comedian, now working in America a lot. This is photographed by Rankin, and it looks very similar to the previous work you've seen. Okay, so it looks similar to Mishimo. It looks similar to Guido Reni. However, the context is different. What I've done is I've removed the image in between. So it's not the exact same, and it's not about sacrifice. It comes from this source, and this makes a difference. When you look at when images are made, the year they're made, always be aware that that might be the second or third variation. This is where this comes from. This is Muhammad Ali in April 1996, and he's being asked by the American government to go to war in Vietnam. And he says no. Two reasons. He's converted to Islam, and he's also said, I'm not going to go and fight. And so they strip him of his boxing titles. And so the magazine, Esquire, puts this on the front cover where he's saying, the governments have stripped me of my title, well, the governing bodies have stripped me of my world titles in boxing because I've not done this, and I'm being sacrificed. So that's in 1968. So that's important, the timeline of when these works are put together. When you look at the Ricky Gervais version in context, then you see this is how it's going to be used. So this is two different approaches. One is very serious, and one is almost very political, and one is just playing on the previous version, 50 years previously. So this is interesting. You're probably going, what is it? Well, actually, it's a piece of artwork. Remember we spoke about the Chapman brothers and when they were putting clowns' faces onto Goya prints? This is similar. This is also about ownership. It's also about the idea of basically, what is it? So this is by Robert Rauschenberg, American artist, 1953. Now, this is a piece of artwork that he's created by destroying. What I mean by that is, this is it. It originally was a piece of work by William de Kooning. So it's a drawing. So he's bought a William de Kooning drawing that he now owns. So he's an artist, and he's bought another artist's piece of work. And then he takes an eraser and he literally removes all of the image. He cleans it off, he reframes it, and now it's his work. Conceptually, quite an interesting idea. We, until recently, had no idea what the original work looked like. However, it looks like this, and we only know this as a variation of it because it was done through infrared processing 10, 12 years ago. And now we get an idea of what William de Kooning's work was, as opposed to how Robert Rauschenberg has erased it to make something new. Question, again, going back to the question we mentioned about the Chapman brothers, is it vandalism? Is it cultural vandalism, or has it created something new? I don't know the answer to that, so I can't help. Don't know the answer. But it's a really interesting approach to take something else and make something else of it. So Walter Benjamin said this, and we keep coming back to this notion of where you take things from and where you take them to, and what is authenticity. So he said, the authenticity of a thing is the essence of all that it's transmissible from its beginning, where it starts, then ranging from its substantive duration, how long it lasts, to its testimony of history, which it's experienced. So this is an interesting approach to, as an idea, where you can take things, what is authentic, what is original, what has happened in between something being made, appropriated, reused, recontextualized. Very interesting. And that's from, I think, called The Work of Art in the Mechanical Age, so the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So nearly finished. I'm going to show you these. So these are a series of adverts for Jeep. Go where they want to. So you have the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You have the Acropolis. I can't remember, this is a big center in Japan. Now, these images were never taken or for this purpose, never meant to be used in this way. These are from a publication called Small World by the British photographer Martin Parr. And what he's done is he's sold them, or they've been sold to usage rights to Argentina. This is where they come from. The original source material is exactly the same. There is no difference. So there's no reinterpretation of the content. What there is how they're used. So if you know that the original source material is a project about what tourism can look like possibly, and what do tourists do, and the fact that it's such a small world, we all do the same things, then you understand that when it's being used by an agency to sell Jeep, this is where it might come from. So there's actually just a reappropriation of the whole concept. I was going to show you that. So nearly finished. Who had the idea first? This is important. Going back to what we said about nothing being original, you have this. So this is Giacomo Balla, girl running in a balcony. And this is a kind of painting. I'm not going to tell you when it's from because that'll spoil it. So it's an interesting painting. It looks like a kind of pointillist painting. This is Edward Muybridge, human figure walking downstairs. This is Marcel Duchamp's painting of a nude descending a staircase number 2. Then this is Marcel Duchamp himself descending a staircase by a photographer, Elliot Ellefson. And then this is light descending a staircase movement by a Japanese photographer, Takahisa Sato, sorry. So they all look very similar in content, but their functions are totally different. So this is it. So Muybridge did the first version of this, was 1887. This is a scientific study of movement using photography to prove the human figure in motion. The right-hand side is Giacomo Balla, girl running in a balcony. This is part of a futurist art exhibition, Italian. Marcel Duchamp, nude descending a staircase, is 2 years after Giacomo Balla. So you can actually see how this begins to come together, where the same idea of something as simple as a scientific study turns into movement, turns into kind of almost like philosophical space. This is interesting. If you look at it very carefully, this is an advert for Volkswagen again. And if you the one on the top left-hand side is how we see the advert. It is meant to be published upside down. When you turn it around, you will notice that the eyes and the mouth are the right way round. And this is quite interesting. This is called, it's called the Thatcher experiment. And this was done in 1980 by a man called Peter Thomson, who was professor of psychology at University of York. This Thatcher effect, as he called it, was where you can reverse the lips and the eyes, turn them upside down, and the human eye will still see them and recognize them as normal. But it's only when you turn them the other way that you realize, oh, this is interesting. So here, the audience, who's in Argentina in this case, games are being played with them by Volkswagen, and that becomes really interesting. But this is based on something else. Again, you have to know the narrative here. So this is Ophelia. This is Hamlet's sister, and she drowns herself. And these various forms, from illustration to photography to lightbox to illustration, make sense of the story. They won't exist without the Waterhouse, sorry, the Millet original. When we see this one, we go, right, we understand the narrative. And then you can use this narrative to say other things in different ways, in different cultural aspects. Really useful. So long as you know it's a story of a woman who would rather drown than go into a nunnery, then you understand it's about sacrifice. So the rest of the images in some way refer back to what sacrifice is. So again, this notion of appropriation can sometimes be completely direct. This is Nissan taking the idea of, we'll just take this large car up there. It's all photoshopped, obviously, but from this source, which is not photoshopped, these are people, builders, having their lunch, sitting on skyscraper at the top of skyscraper. This is Charles Ebert's 1932, the building of skyscrapers. So you can take the ideas. The one on the right-hand side, left-hand side by Nissan, you might think, whoa, clever, if you've never seen the original before. If you know where the original comes from, you realize that it's either paying homage to Ebert's image, or it's just something that's being kind of slightly ripped off. So the words you see there, you're probably seeing the word headlight. You're probably seeing the word shock absorbers, and you're probably seeing the words disc brake. You're not. What you're seeing there is a Cambridge experiment. Okay, so headlight, shock absorbers, disc brake. This again is an advert for Audi. And what it's playing on is this notion. It's called the Cambridge University. So according to research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and the last letters be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess and you can still read it with problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. So this is interesting. We'll go back. So you can play games and reshape how people see things. So appropriating the notion and idea of this beginning and end of a word is how we actually read the word. We don't read the parts in between. Quite clever that. Again, if you half shut your eyes, if you squint slightly, just squint slightly, what you will see is a skull. But all is vanity. 1892. It's a woman at a dressing table, and the eye sockets are represented by her head. Not a new idea, but when Vincent Peters did this for Dior's perfume called Poison, he's using the same format. They are more than 100 years apart, but the notion of where it comes from and is reused, very useful. You'll all recognize Michelangelo's David. This is a McDonald's version, not by them, by the way. This is a Levi's version, and this is interesting. This is photoshopped quite heavily. This is designed for a health farm, for a gymnasium. So you're taking the same form, but you're changing how the audience will actually reuse it. I'm not sure that any of these would really sort of work. Nearly finished. So this is Bob Dylan, and he's producing this piece. It's a piece of moving image for one of his kind of songs, Subterranean Homesick Blues, and he's literally just throwing it away. That idea is then reused by people like Orlan. We saw her earlier in a different format, where she gives people a piece of paper, a pen, and says, write how you feel on this, and she photographs them. So the man with the dog is glad, the woman in the middle is sad, and the girl at the end is mad. Interesting approach. That idea is then reused by Gillian Waring. Again, something very similar. It's called Signs That Say What You Want Them to Say and Not Signs What Someone Else Wants You to Say. Taking the same concept and just writing on how they feel, what they think, or entire quotes from books, from the Bible as well. Pardon me. It's been used ad infinitum. Governments use it. It's a kind of shorthand. It works. Again, it's been used by this artist, Michael Ensminger. Again, these are meant to be amusing. They're meant to be kind of funny and light. What's your sign? So these are kind of series of, down and outs, homeless people, need to get the new Britney Spears CD. Anything will do. Interesting. Or work faster for internet access. So the form and design of the tramp, of the homeless person, is being used in one way, and then the words themselves are being used in another. So I need to know what Julia Roberts wore at the Oscars. Actually, maybe I don't. Or, actually, I lost 35 pounds. Ask me how. So it becomes an interesting kind of an idea where you draw things together. I hope that makes sense, because we're nearly finished. So, in any case, always remember what Jean-Luc Godard said, and he died, last month, I think. He said this: it's not where you take things from, it's where you take them to. Okay, so that's the original quote, and it's by a man called Jim Jarmusch. Really interesting. Nothing is original. Steal from anywhere that resonates with inspiration or fuels your imagination. Devour old films, new films, music, books, paintings, photographs, poems, dreams, random conversations, architecture, bridges, street signs, trees, clouds, bodies of water, light, and shadows. Select only things to steal that speak directly to your soul. If you do this, your work and your theft will be authentic. Authenticity is invaluable. Originality is non-existent. And don't bother to conceal your thievery. Celebrate it if you like. In any case, always remember what Jean-Luc Godard said. It's not where you take things from, it's where you take them to. That's the important part. And that's the end. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Fingers crossed, that's worked. Yep, stop sharing my screen. Does anyone have any questions? You're all sitting there like going, whoa, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. No questions whatsoever.
Okay.
Nope.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you, Rob. It's quite interesting, though. that you say to us what you mentioned about the connectivity and appropriation. Okay. Uh, I just remember one. Uh, do you know Dude with Sign in Instagram?
Oh, I don't actually, but I'm going to make a note of it with my pen and a bit of paper. Dude with
Dude with Sign,
signs.
I thought he was original though, but actually it's almost the same like what I don't know if I can
Oh,
show you here.
hold on.
Dude with Sign.
I'm just making a note. Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I think what's interesting there is just for everybody. Um, Something that might look original and brand new is not really usually original. It comes from other sources. So, dude with sign, he might be doing that on his own and thinking this is brand new, but then again, it already exists in some other forms, which either means maybe he's seen something, on Instagram or some other place, and he thinks it's original and is using aspects of it, or possibly he has never seen it before. In which case, for him, it's original and new, but for creative designers, they probably recognize where it comes from. And this is where it gets slightly interesting. It's the difference between, designers working on projects who have backgrounds where they know where ideas come from, and a kind of non-designer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So it's just different perspective, and then it will be a different result as well. Is it?
Yeah.
Right. And then what else? So basically, because here, right, we are in a joint project between the Ciputra University and then we have Birmingham, as I went to your class yesterday, and then we have from Tunku Abdul Rahman, University of Management and Technology here. I just want to ask you about what's your tips about the like from the your topic, the connectivity and appropriation, due to their project. So basically, they were talking about the
Ah,
SDGs, right? So how to relate
yep.
these to SDGs? Like, what should they do? Like, if they want to do like an appropriation or something like that. Is there any tips from you, Rob?
Uh, there's a few tips. The first one is be aware of copyright. That's the first one is be really aware of copyright, because if you're using something that's someone else's image, that they or their piece of work, you can be sued. Okay, so be aware of copyright and IP, which is why a lot of big campaigns, they'll use kind of scientific ideas, or they'll use really old materials. There's a really good book called The A to Z of Ideas by a man called John Ingledew, and it's basically the alphabet, and he takes you through A, B, C, D, and each area he gives you an idea of how you can solve a creative brief using art or hands or thinking. But we had a tutorial just after your finished session, so you finished with us yesterday, Ray, and Christian is not here. And our students were asking, right, how do we start to get the ideas for sustainable development? So the first thing we've asked them to do is to look through the 17 and select one that really interests them. So I had some tutorials, for example, with one of my students, Johnny. Now he's an illustrator who does a lot of printmaking, and he had the idea because he suffers from insomnia, so he doesn't sleep that well, and he's been doing some work about it. So he looked at the kind of the health aspect of one of the, I can't remember which one it was. I think one of the health one was number, oh, what was health? Number 3, good health and well-being. So he was looking at that, and what he was saying was, how can I use some of these ideas? And so what he started to do was look at appropriating things like zoetropes and how the ideas can work as a kind of moving piece. And he actually started looking at, in fact, can I share my screen with you? I'm just going to see if I can get this up.
Sure.
Um, so, yeah, there's a website that he was using. Whoops, hold on. Here we go. I'm going to show you this if I can. I'm just going to share my screen. So there's a couple of websites that we asked students to use. I'll just share them with you as well. So we've asked them to look at 3 websites. So one is called Um, themovingposter.com. It's very new. I mean, it's very, very new. And what it is, when it comes up, still under test mode. These are posters, but they're graphic design posters. However, they're used to be seen on your phone. So actually, they move. So the poster itself becomes more than just a static image. And what we have here is the idea that posters are now designed for people who have phones. And I think this is an interesting area where how you design work now changes considerably. So the moving poster, we've said to them, is something they should look at. Okay, so moving posters, he's thinking, do I design a poster about insomnia that might work for sustainable goals? So these are really useful. So the movingposter.com is very, very new, but it's an interesting element. The other area we ask students to look at, there's a website we ask students to use every day. It's called It's Nice That, and I can't spell. I can't spell. And basically, it's graphic design, illustration, photography, collage, film, animation, and it's updated every single day. And what they do is, so for example, this morning, 18 hours ago, this piece of graphic design by Noah Baker, poster design, it's about how he avoids getting stuck in aesthetic holes. So if I just click on it, it'll take me to the article. So this is mainly about graphic design, typography, posters, and process. And then there's a really interesting article, interview, discussion, which becomes useful. So it's nice that is really useful. And so this morning, 14 hours ago, we had 5 thing about families. 13 hours ago, Brixton communities. 12 hours ago, graphic design identities from the Chicago Institute of Design. And it's really useful. So new works in photography. And you can find every day it's in there. It's really interesting. But if you go to the search bar, you can type in anything. So I'll put in, say, I'm going to put in, all right, so what I'm going to do is
Maybe
one of the
like,
sustainable goals.
for
So I'm going to
example,
put
maybe
in,
like life on land, or yeah, we're talking about the life on land, maybe.
so life on
Land.
land. So I don't know what's going to come up, but there are 293 articles in different areas of photography, graphic design, advertising that deal with the
That's
notion of
interesting.
life on land. Oh, this is interesting. A comic artist, Jan Ho Choi. Oh, interesting. So life on land. If I were to put in one of the other headings, so if I choose another heading, say, I don't know, say no poverty. I'm going to put in the first one, no poverty. So if I
No
just,
poverty. Yeah.
no poverty, see what it comes up with. 45 articles on, so again, it's a really useful website, and it is updated like literally every day. You see new materials. So that's one website we're asking all our students to look at, just to sort of spark the ideas and also to tie in with the themes. The other one we're asking them to look at is Ads of the World. I'm going to show you this partly because it's good for research, but it's also good for developing campaigns. So it's called adsoftheworld.com. And I subscribe to it. So every week I get the new campaigns, the new student campaign, the new professional ones. And what you can do is this. It's basically, these are the most recent, these adverts will have been done in the last few days. So for example, gosh, they've changed all since yesterday. So this is I'm going to show you this. This is an advert for the Vienna Tourist Board, Belly. So the client is the Vienna Tourist Board. So if you can click on that, it'll take you to a link. The agency is called Young von Matt. I don't know what it is. The concept is inclusivity takes many forms, but Vienna is one of the most unexpected protect. So this just tells you the idea of the concept. It's for the Vienna Tourist Board by Jungwort. The country is Austria, it's Europe, it's a film, and the subject is hospitality and tourism. The art director is, or the creative director is Michael Maria Mordo. So I'll just play it, see what it. So this is whoa. So this is the story of a man exercising and his belly decides to leave him and go on holiday, which is, so the belly is now going on holiday. It's leaving, and he's sorry, he has to go, he's sad. The music's interesting. This goes on for quite a while, so I'm not going to show you all of it. The belly is now flying into Vienna on the plane. It's arriving at the airport and going on holiday. Interesting concept.
I don't know if I can explain why.
Okay, I'm going to stop that there because it goes on for far too long. But the interesting concept. But what you can do with this website is this. You can actually type in. So say for example, let's go for just a keyword on its own, poverty, and then just leave it blank instead.
Poverty.
Yeah, any country. So in the world now, suddenly these are all the things to deal with poverty. I don't know. So this is a student one. So the student one is a school, MSA University. This is an agency, BBD, British agency. So these are all just about different poverty in different countries. So that's an important part. You can actually specify. So this looks like it may be France, and you just click on them. Sausage roll campaign, and so if you can, so I don't know. Say if we clicked on, I don't know. Let's just click on. Oh, there we go. Let's click on this one. We've not seen this used before. Okay, so this is for Oxfam, poverty on the curb, and this is done by students at SJ School. So we click on this. So it's for Oxfam, the client. It's on the theme of poverty. You've recognized this because you've seen it before. It's been appropriated. It's by students at New School of Publications. So the students at Syracuse University are sort of seeing what inequality is about on the campus. The art director is Ami Jin, copywriter Joshua Race. So it's Oxford, it's America, North America. Oh, it's experiential, interesting. It's non-government public interest, and it's a student project. So we click on it and it'll take us to the project. So what is it like to ask for money on the curb, on the street, in the 13th poorest city in America? We're determined to find out. So this is a student project. So they're using Oxfam, and they're just saying, I'm going to use this, of using the street sign to see, can I get money?
Well, yeah. That's interesting.
Does that make sense, Ray?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to just stop sharing because I realized I've gone over a little bit there, so I'm sorry. But some of those websites are kind of interesting just to spark the ideas. So my students are starting to research the 17 themes. They're selecting the ones that they want. They're using those websites, and then they'll start to develop their own ideas and maybe use things like connectivity and 15 ways to stay creative. Is that useful for people?
Yeah. All good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. It's quite interesting website, and so we can get any reference, right, for our design or for our campaign for it on. So is there any question from students?
Hello, Mr. My name is Michael. So I want to ask you a question.
Yep.
I think art consists of feeling. How do we connect with art?
Oh, how do you define feeling is the question I would ask Michael. I think it depends on what you're trying to do. When artists put work together, one thing to bear in mind, the way we view art now is not the way it was viewed 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Art galleries are a modern concept. Art galleries start in the UK at least, I think it's about 1815. Before that, art is in private hands. It's made for people to own. So how you feel about something, it depends. So I don't know if you're aware of the current controversy in the UK. There's been some oil protesters, teenagers usually, who have been throwing paint and tins of soup onto artworks. So they threw some soup onto Sunflowers by Van Gogh. They threw potatoes in France onto Monet's haystacks. In Britain yesterday, so you probably don't know this, Ray, they went into Madame Tussauds waxworks in London, and they got some cake and they put it into the face of the king. So they're protesting. So the notion of how do you feel about art, it depends on what the art is designed for. So some artists, like we showed you, the Chapman brothers, they do art that makes people sometimes angry. but it makes them think in different ways. So it depends on what you wanted to do. Do you know, Michael, I don't think I've answered your question, but it was a good question anyway.
Thank you.
No, you're welcome. Any other oh, someone's running around the corner there with a laptop. She should be careful, she might fall over. Sorry, any other questions?
Right, so
What's your name?
my name is Brian. Hi, hi, sir.
Hi, Ryan.
Okay, so the question is, it is said that the creation of art is not about where we took things from, but rather
Yep.
where we take them to. Is that correct?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, so my question is, how about modern companies that took an art piece and modified them in such way for their commercial purposes? For example, we can take the artwork of American Gothic by Grindwood and Self-Portrait by Van Gogh. As we can see, McDonald's used those artworks and modified them by adding a bacon onto it to promote their own product. So would that be appropriate to do, since the original and modified art serve different purpose and conceptual meaning?
That's a good question, Ryan. That's a good question.
Thank you.
This is where the cultural context comes in. So that advert, or that set of adverts, sorry, they were designed purely for a Swedish audience. And in Sweden, there's the sense of humor is different. Excuse me. The sense of humor is different. So one of the aspects you have to think about when you're designing things, and especially when you're going to go for the kind of 17 parts for the kind of sustainability project, you have to think about the audience. So the appropriation of a kind of piece of fine art, like, Grant was American Gothic, or, Van Gogh's self-portrait, it recontextualizes completely the idea of where it comes from. So the point is, the audience probably recognizes some of what it is. Is it right to do it as a separate question? The first one is, who actually owns the copyright to Van Gogh? Well, it's in the public domain, but it's probably owned by a museum someplace. So they may be able to sell copyright, to the company itself. There's a separate question there about, is it right to do it? It depends on the culture. So for example, in Van Gogh's home country, would they feel happy about the fact that it's being used for this advert? Probably not. But then would you imagine that in, say, Scandinavia, in Sweden, would they be happy to use Edvard Munch's The Scream? So Edvard Munch's The Scream, it's a Scandinavian painting. Would they feel more comfortable using that? They might feel offended using that because that's part of their culture. Whereas Van Gogh is not part of their culture and is seen as an iconic painting. So there's a fine balance between being able to say, does it cause offense? Can we use it? The next question is, how do you use anything to sell a product? Coming up with a new idea is really quite difficult. So that notion of originality doesn't necessarily hold. Authenticity is. So there's a couple I think are really interesting. The Volkswagen adverts, where they use the join the dots, almost like a child's game, is a really interesting way to deconstruct a piece of classical art and then turn it into something that becomes a child a game can play. Again, Ryan, I don't know if I answered the question. Did I?
You did. Thanks very much.
I did. Hey, good. Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Robert.
All right. Who are you? What's your name?
My name is Nadia.
Yep.
Okay, and I want to ask you a question. So, since in our major we'll be doing commercial work, how can we prevent our work from being considered as a form of plagiarism? Because as far as I know, there's still no fixed law. That is the standard of characteristic of people imitating our work. That's it. Thank you, Mr. Robert.
Thanks, Nadia. That's a really difficult question. I might just leave the room now then. No. Okay, that's a really good question. And in terms of plagiarism, it's a fine line. So bear in mind that if someone creates something new, they will own the copyright. They will probably own the IP, the intellectual copyright as well. They probably own that as well. Plagiarism, if what you're doing is so close to the original that you're almost saying it's yours, that's plagiarism. So plagiarism comes down to being able to say, if you, for example, if I showed you a painting of the Mona Lisa and I said, I painted this, that's plagiarism because I didn't. So it's to do with kind of ownership as well. If I then say I'm taking the Mona Lisa, like Marcel Duchamp did, and I'll paint a moustache on it, I'm then doing something to it to change it. So the level of plagiarism depends on two things. One, how much change you've made to the original work, but also, you know, how relative is the change in relation to what it's going to be used for. So the kind of McDonald's thing is an interesting one because the changes were minor, but the actual concept was hugely different. So that's one thing. The second thing is the kind of ownership of the idea being different from the ownership of the original kind of source material. So the example I would say there is the difference between plagiarism and the fine line between it is if you say this is completely mine and you don't pay reference or homage to the original sources or acknowledge the original sources and you say they are yours, I would argue that is plagiarism, even though it may be a kind of small part. You're not acknowledging the original source. And if you acknowledge the original source, you're then saying it's not plagiarism. I'm using someone else's form of design or composition, use of color, concept, and then it becomes less plagiarism. Plagiarism is literally you saying, you know, hold on, I'll show you. I'm going to think, oh, have I got anything? I don't have anything. Oh, plagiarism is I made the design on this cup. Me, I did this. That's plagiarism because I didn't. Okay, I own the cup, but it's plagiarism if I say it's mine. Does that make sense, Nadia?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Robert.
Hey, any more questions before you go and have lunch and I go and have breakfast? Oh, a question. Go on. What's your name?
Good morning, Mr. Robert. My name is Nera. My question is, I think I remember you giving us tips about, about our next project of not getting copyright. Is that correct?
Copyright's an interesting area you have to be
Yeah,
careful with because if
it
you're going
was.
to,
I'm sorry. You can continue.
oh, no, carry on.
Oh,
You carry
okay.
on.
So it was the first step that you give us. So it was quite interesting. Me and my mates was we were having like this project about looking for the right track for our short movie. So this reminds me about this problem. Um, do you happen to know this quite famous YouTuber called PewDiePie?
I don't know.
So this
I've heard of it though.
pretty he was apparently from Sweden and he was quite famous. So he made this song. It was quite popular and I would love to say the name, but it's quite inappropriate. He used the B word in the title, so
Oh, okay.
okay.
I'm not going to say it either, so don't worry.
So this song, he apparently published said like anyone can use the song without getting copyright. So because like he hated the idea of the word DMCA and like people getting copyright for using some other artist's musics. So
Okay.
apparently for a few years, quite recently, he checked the videos. Some random company, they said they represent PewDiePie, like so. And apparently, for all those years, people who's been using his music videos, like putting on tracks on their videos, they got copyrighted somehow by some I don't know random company. So the real question is, what uh what are your thoughts on this? Companies
Oh,
taking over some artists' musics.
well, the two things in there. Well, several things in there actually. So, sorry, Nero. There's several things in there. One, if the original's kind of the originator of the material says it's not copyrighted, can someone then say I own the copyright? Probably not, because that wouldn't stand up in court. The thing about copyright is, so for example, years and years ago, it was really quite interesting. Someone tried to copyright the letter E. So on every typeface, the letter E, the minute you use the letter E in anything, this person will get money. Obviously, it didn't go through because it doesn't make sense. How would they collect the money? But the concept of copyright is interesting. Copywriting music or sound. So there are copyright-free music kind of websites where you can get a lot of interesting material. But if someone says anyone can use it and it's copyright-free, you can use it. If someone else then chooses to say, I'm going to copyright someone else's work, I don't think they can. Well, no, sorry, rephrase that. I don't think they legally can, but they may be able to set up something that says, I do own elements of this, like a website and saying it. So the example of it is there. I'll give you an example. There's an artist called Anish Kapoor. So he's a British artist, brilliant sculptor, great ideas. And he invented, I'm using the term invented because he didn't invent, he invented a specific shade of black. And this black absorbs something like 95 or 96% of the light. So when you use it on sculpture or use it in various formats, it actually looks like, it's like looking into space. So he copyrighted that color. And so no one else can use it but him. So you have to go and ask him to use it. Now there's another artist who got really, I wasn't going to swear, who got really annoyed about an artist doing this. So this other artist, whose name I can't remember, he invented a shade of pink. And this shade of pink you can buy, and you have to sign an agreement to say that you're buying this shade of pink, but you are not Anish Kapoor. So Anish Kapoor cannot buy this shade of pink from this artist. So because he's copyrighted it. And so they're playing this game of, well, I'm a very serious artist, Anish Kapoor, and I've invented this shade of black, but no one else can use it. You have to ask me. This other artist has invented this shade of pink, and he won't allow Anish Kapoor to use it. So you sign a contract that says, I am not Anish Kapoor, I can use this color. So the copyright argument you can use, you can actually use it in a funny way. You can use it as an effect. You can use it as part of a campaign. What is copyright? What is it for? It's usually there to protect the kind of integrity and the kind of income generation scheme of the artist. So that's an interesting one. But so if PewDiePie is saying, yeah, I can go and use this, you can use it. How you use it is interesting. Where you use it is also interesting. So if you're going to, and everyone will do this, you're all doing this this kind of live brief we're all doing, it's going to go to be curated. People are going to look at it. You have to think about the audience, how they're going to react, or more importantly, how you want them to react. That's quite a different thing to your work. How do you want them to react to something you've done? And you can make them angry, you can make them laugh, you can make them cry. That's your job as a designer, as a kind of visual communicator. You're in charge of that. You have to understand how to make people think and feel by what you're doing. And the fact that we all have themes from, zero hunger to kind of the life on land or in water or pollution or sanitation, we can make points with those. I think, Nera, I think I may have answered a question. I may have answered my first question today. Thank you. Oh, brilliant.
Thank you for your time.
Any other questions?
Good morning,
No.
sir. Can you hear my voice?
Who are you?
Right. Okay,
What's
my
your
name
name?
is Jason, and I'd like to ask a question. So it is mentioned earlier that originality is non-existent. So
Mhm.
if originality is non-existent, then why are we always constantly asked to make something original? Something that people have never seen or known before. Because the way I see the society right now, if somebody takes an inspiration from someone, he or she modifies it in their own style, it is still counted as plagiarism media. And it may lead to a stigma to the people where he or she cannot make
something original and that he or she stole someone else's work. So what's your view on that? Thank you.
Uh, Thanks, that's a difficult one. Why are you asking difficult questions? It's nearly lunchtime. I think the interesting thing there is when we say this is the two things to think about. One, you have to think about what we mean by original or originality. When you produce something that's original to you, that's new, that's an interesting point of view. I've done something that I've never done before. Now that can be a process, it can be a technique, it can be finding a new way of seeing things. So there's a really great painting by Salvador Dali, and it's from about 1974, 75. And from a distance, like, from 500 meters, it looks like the head of Abraham Lincoln, the American president. As you get closer to it, it changes into his wife, and it changes. In fact, hold on, it's called Einstein Monroe. It changes because as you get closer, you see it. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. If you give me a second, I'm going to try and show you something. I think it's on YouTube, I'm not sure. So I'm just going to show you this very briefly if I can find it. And it's how you can change people's perceptions and originality. Watch this. So what you're seeing, this is just going to move towards you and it's going to change, okay? Ready? Einstein. Marilyn Monroe. Does that make sense? So that an interesting thing that the notion of trying to produce something original, you'll start from original sources and you can make them work in different ways. But if you'll make something new from it, and I think that's the interesting point, making something new. The notion of originality, you say nothing can be. I would argue that it's never real original, but it can be authentic, and that's when you do something. You can take something. So you could take 2 or 3 different paintings. You make a collage. You've made something new. Someone might recognize the elements of design. So how do you see is also an important point. This is an important point. You're designing for an audience, and when you design for an audience, you need to know the audience. So if I'm designing, say, if some of my students are designing packaging for a children's product, they'll use a different set of design criteria than designing packaging for, say, an adult audience who are buying, I don't know, some sort of oils. Does that make sense? I'm not sure I've answered your question there. Do you want to follow up?
Yes, it does make sense, sir. Yeah, that answered my question. Thank you very much.
Hey, brilliant. Thank you. Hey. Oh,
Good morning, sir. My name is
yeah,
Rachel.
okay.
My name is
Morning,
Rachel.
Rachel.
Yeah. And I am quite curious about something. You were talking about a lot of things regarding appropriation in art and how to utilize it in your own art to strengthen its message. As you said previously, one of the major obstacles to now is copyright issues. How do we as designers know if a certain work of art have a copyright, and to what extent does that copyright protect that art?
Good question. Probably the first thing to think about is whenever you, this is important. I'm assuming, Rachel, you have used a thing called the internet, have you? Yes, you have. We all have. Okay. One of the things you need to do, if you're looking at certain websites, you have to try and find the original author. So sometimes if you do a kind of a Google search, a reverse search on Google Images, you can often find where the original sources might come from, because we use that for plagiarism. So if a student produces a piece of work that we're not sure about, we'll do a reverse image Google search to find out where it might come from. And then by doing that, you can find the original sources. In terms of, in terms of kind of where you find them from, if it's classical, people probably know it's going to be in a gallery someplace or a private collection, and you can usually find those sources. So, for example, if I said, where do we find sunflowers? Well, there's one in London. There's one in the Rijksmuseum. You know, is there one in the Rijksmuseum? I need to check that. So there's certain places where you can find them, and you know you're going to get them. So they're the sources. So what you look for are credible sources where you find the initial material. So the example I would give is I had a student a few years ago who was doing a presentation on, I think it was on a photographer. It was on a photographer, and they'd gone to a website, and the website had said this particular photograph was taken by this photographer. And so the student had referenced it, and we had to tell the student, you are wrong. Okay. And what they had done was they hadn't found the original source as much as they could, and they had accepted what the website said as fact. And the website was wrong. So whenever you come to look at anything, if you can, cross-reference with multiple sources. So, for example, I would recommend for some students doing photography, you look at something like American Suburb X, which is a history site. Or you would, if you're doing fashion, you would look at designscene.net, or you're looking for design materials. It's nice that you're trying to find sources, and ask your tutors, because they'll know sources that you won't know. And then the other one is, if you're not sure where something comes from, don't use it. I mean, if you're really going, actually, I'm not sure, then don't use it. Or maybe use a small part of it. Does that make sense, Rachel? So it's that kind of notion of doing a reverse search on Google Images does sometimes help. Yeah?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I kind of forgot what I wanted to ask next. Wait, let me think.
You can ask me what I'm going to have for breakfast. I'm going to have some muesli and toast in about 20 minutes.
So yeah, so as you said, that means research is very, very important. So like
Yep.
finding new resources. And so do you have any specific sites that we can use as a reference for our current project? Or
Ooh, well, there's several things. One, when it comes to your specialism, say what your specialism is, and try and find the websites for the specialism. Does that make sense?
yeah.
So things like, it's nice that I would use. Actually, hold on. Can I share my screen with you? I'll just okay, I'm going to show you a couple of websites. So so if you were doing, for example, say you were doing photography, you would look at American Suburb X. This website is just all about kind of just different types of photography, from fine art photography, documentary photography, historical elements. You'll find in here interviews, videos, gallery visits. You'll find essays, reviews. So American Suburb is pretty useful. Again, in terms of, I'm going to show my bookmarks. Yeah. So where are we? So this one's good for royalty-free music. So if you go to royalty-free, this one's good. It's called Ben Sound. So Ben Sound, you can find a whole stack of different materials. Ambient, cool. Go away. So that's one I would use. That's interesting. In terms of different artists, Dave McKean, he's a really interesting kind of all-round visual communicator. He does photography, illustration, record designs, album covers. I mean, he's really very interesting. If you look at his portfolio, you can find a whole stack of different materials. He's someone that I'd be going, so if I were to look for, say, children's books or adverts, let's go for adverts. You know, if you look at some of the things he's done, we asked him to come up and do some talks years ago. Not talks. What did he do? He was at one of our awards ceremonies, and he does some really interesting materials. I've shown you moving poster. So moving poster is pretty useful. I mean, this is still, we're asking students to use this. It's nice that where is it? Oh yeah, this is interesting. There's a Canadian company called Adbusters, and what they do is they take advertising campaigns and they turn them on their head. So they make almost the opposites of advertising. They do spoof ads, and they've been doing them for quite a long time. So they'll take the original advert and they'll change it. So this advert for Balenciaga is, you know, Balenciaga, an advert, sorry, a shoe is going to cost you thousands of pounds. So they just turn the whole thing on its head. They do almost like kind of negative advertising. You know, I mean, it's really interesting where they take ideas. So I would have a look at them as well. They're pretty useful. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So have a look at some of those, because as starting points, you can actually you can make something negative and positive if you know how, but it will come back to two things. You need to bear in mind who the audience is. So you can have the most brilliant set of designs, and they can work for you and they can work for the kind of tutors, but if they don't work for the audience, they're going to fail. So you have to think about that. Does that make sense, Rachel? It's about the audience as well.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for the insight, sir. Hope you have a great day ahead of you.
Cool. Thank you for all students. Thank you, Rob.
Brilliant. Okay, brilliant.
It's very nice. It's nice. Oh, is it? Was the website? Was that? It's nice that.
Oh,
It's nice that.
it's nice. Yeah, it's nice that it's one we ask all our students to check every morning, because the archive is enormous and it covers all areas of visual communication. Some of the content you think, this is really very interesting. So yeah, I would advise people to sort of make a habit of checking things daily.
Yeah, it's a good word as
Yeah.
well. Like, it's nice that you having you here, Rob,
Ah,
to share,
thank you.
to share your knowledge about the connectivity and appropriation. That was good, and I think that's all. Thank you for everything. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for answering our questions, and maybe that's it. Thank you, Rob.
Okay. Thanks,
Right.
Ray. Bye,
Thank you. Have
everyone.
a good
Have a
day.
good
Have a good
one.
day there. Right. Cool.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.